name is Roosevelt Grant, and welcome to today's webinar. We have a lot of great information to present to you today. Participants will be muted and in listen mode only. Today's webinar will be recorded. Later, we will post today's recording, the slides, and transcript onto HUD Exchange. If you have any content-related questions, please submit those to the Q&A box. You should see that on the right side of your screen. Content-related questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical questions related to the webinar itself, and you're having any issues with that, also please submit your technical questions via the Q&A box. Our host today will address those questions that are of a technical nature. And I'd like to take this time to acknowledge Ms. Joshani Clemens, who's been very instrumental in helping us get these webinars for HUD set up. So with that, I'd like to thank Joshani. And if you have a quick moment or would like to say something about the surveys, Joshani.
Thank you, Roosevelt. Hi, guys, and thanks for joining us. I just have one thing to say. There is a click to eval box right under the attendee box where all of you guys are listed. If you could click on that survey link, the Browse To button will come on and it will lead you to SurveyMonkey so you can complete the survey before you exit this quote-unquote room. If not, it's okay because it will be sent to you today and tomorrow. Thank you, guys. Have a great meeting.
Okay, thank you, Joshani. So today's webinar is part of HUD's 2020 CDBG-MIT webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Coordination of HUD CDBG Programs, in particular DR and MIT, and FEMA Mitigation Programs, including the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. We are excited to have this joint webinar today between the Mitigation Directorate of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and HUD's Community Planning and Development, Office of Community Planning and Development, and in particular, their Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division. So, welcome. I'm going to do some quick introductions. First, let me introduce Ms. H. Camille Crane. She's with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Camille is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Section Chief at FEMA headquarters. She is responsible for the design and administration of FEMA's newest mitigation grant program. She came to FEMA headquarters from FEMA Region 6, where she served as the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Branch Chief in the Mitigation Division. She also worked for FEMA Region 4, where she served as a Senior HMA Program Manager, and this including leading the states of Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. Camille also was the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and she managed their Mitigation Grant Program and Planning Office. She brings over 20 years of experience with FEMA HMA grant programs at the university, state, and federal level. With that, I'd like to thank Camille for joining us today for today's webinar. We have Michaela Catani, who's a CBD specialist with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She's with the Office of Community Planning Development and in particular supports the policy unit for the Disaster Recovery and Special Issues Division. Again, thank you, Michaela, for joining us. My name is Roosevelt Grant. I'm also with FEMA. I support the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and I'm on a temporary assignment to HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, and I also support the policy unit. Here's an overview for today's presentation. First, Michaela will walk us through HUD CDBG-MIT purpose and goals. Camille will address the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. I will take a look at HMGP. I will also provide you with a quick summary and resources and then Michaela will take over with the Q&A at the end of today's webinar. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Michaela, who will start us off. Thank you, Michaela.
Thanks, Roosevelt. I appreciate it. So quickly, we are first going to go over mainly the purpose of CDBG mitigation, but also your CDBG-DR grants. So CDBG-MIT is a unique funding source where the focus is really on carrying out strategic and high-impact activities to mitigate against disasters and reduce future losses. First, for your CDBG-MIT activities, they must meet the definition of mitigation. Then you must do a mitigation needs assessment where you identify both current and future risks in your most impacted and distressed areas. Third, your activities must be CDBG eligible or eligible through a waiver and alternative requirement. And lastly, your activities must meet a national objective, which are to benefit low and moderate income persons. You can also use urgent need mitigation and covered projects. For your urgent need mitigation national objective, you will need to address the current and future risks that you have identified, and then show how these activities will result in measurable and verifiable reduction in the loss of life. Then, if you're choosing to use the covered projects national objective, these are for infrastructure activities that meet the definition of covered projects, which is in the Federal Register notice. And then you also need to be able to show that you've considered and planned for your long-term operations and maintenance of your projects, that all of your activities are consistent and working together to mitigate risks, primarily just making sure that none of your projects have any adverse effects in another area, plus that demonstration of long-term efficacy and financial sustainability, and demonstrating benefit in your mid areas using FEMA's BCA toolkit and having a BCA greater than 1, or including any qualitative descriptions of benefits. Then for your CDBG-DR grants, it's really those main 3 pieces where your activities need to be CDBG eligible or eligible under a waiver, meet a national objective, and address a direct or indirect impact from the major disasters in a presidentially declared county. One of the big emphasis on CDBG mitigation and HUD's goals is maximizing your MIT grants. And this also applies to your more typical CDBG-DR grants as well. So with mitigation, HUD has a few goals for this funding is really to rely on the data-informed investments, building up your capacity to analyze and address disaster risks, as well as updating those hazard mitigation plans, supporting the adoption of policies that reflect both your local and regional priorities to have long-lasting effects in risk reduction, and maximizing the impact of funds by encouraging leveraging and partnerships. And to really emphasize this maximizing of funds, grantees are really encouraged to coordinate and align your mitigation and disaster projects with other federal, state, and local projects. This webinar really highlights some of your options for aligning with FEMA funds. And the notice for mitigation really focuses on advancing long-term resilience to current and future hazards, aligning funds, and promoting joint planning efforts. Aligning and integrating with FEMA. This is because there are many benefits to aligning and integrating with other available programs. FEMA, for example, has a hazard mitigation program, and they're building resilient infrastructures in communities, or BRIC programs, which is the focus of today's webinar. So Some of these benefits, to name a few, are continuous coordination, community plan integration, and high impact projects. And then before turning this over to FEMA, I wanted to point out that your MIT funds can be used for planning activities. So in the Federal Register notice, it specifically points out some planning activities like regional mitigation plans, FEMA's BRIC and HMGP programs, the flood mitigation assistance programs, as well as modernizing building codes, upgrading maps, data, and other capabilities to better understand the disaster risk reduction efforts. And with that, I will turn it over to FEMA.
Thank you. This is Camille Crane, and as Roosevelt nicely said at the beginning, I am the section chief for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community, or BRIC grant program, which is FEMA's newest Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program. I want to start by thanking HUD for giving us this opportunity today to come and share with you where we are in the design build of BRIC and tell you everything we can at this point about the program. So with that, I'm going to get started. So what I'm going to hope to do with you over the next 40 minutes is kind of walk with you through everything that's happening with BRIC, starting with what our legislation, all the way through to where we are currently in design, and I'll give you the schedule for the application period that's going to be opening later this year. If you're familiar with our PDM program, or Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, and that's what BRIC is replacing, I'm going to talk a little bit about how BRIC is different. We'll talk about what a project looks like in BRIC, what's eligible, and then give you some information about some engagements that we're going to have announcing BRIC later this summer. So starting at the beginning, there was the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, and Section 1234 actually created the BRIC program by amending Section 203. What makes us different than the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program is where our funding comes from. So we are funded from disaster, so federal post-disaster grant funding. 6% of certain sections of disaster costs that FEMA pays for go into a BRIC piggy bank, and I'll be talking about that BRIC piggy bank a little later. For our eligible applicants, those include states and territories as well as tribes that have had a major disaster declaration within the last 7 years. And one good thing that came out of everything that's been happening this spring is all states, territories, and the District of Columbia currently have a major disaster declaration, so everyone just got a 7-year buy-in for BRIC. We will be replacing, as I said, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation, or PDM program. It just completed its last cycle with FY19. Those applications were due January 31st, and FEMA is currently announcing the identified for further review. So that's the last cycle of PDM. BRIC will be opening up with fiscal year 20 this fall. One of the things we did when we started, after the legislation was passed in 2018, we wanted to take care with how we developed this program. It's not every day that a federal agency gets a brand new program, so we spent quite a bit of time over the summer of 2019 really going out and looking at what people wanted to see in a program, what were their pain points, what were their hopes. And I'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about that stakeholder engagement. Using that engagement, our senior executives sat down and figured out what would be the 6 guiding principles of BRIC, and those guiding principles are what we've built. In all the design we've done for the program have been built upon these principles. So those principles start with supporting community capability and capacity building. So what could we put into a program that would help communities become more resilient, or to be able to take on their own resiliency actions? We wanted to encourage and enable innovation. We wanted to be very intentional about how we promote partnership, because we know no matter what, there's never going to be enough money in any federal grant program to solve all the mitigation or resiliency needs of the country. So how do we act with intention in promoting partnership? We wanted to be able to enable large infrastructure projects, so that would be playing around with some of the caps. We wanted to have and maintain flexibility for a couple of different reasons. One, we are taking very seriously that we want to be a program that does continuous improvement. So we wanted to have a framework flexible enough that as we mature and as we learn how to do things better, we can incorporate those into the program. The other reason to be flexible is because the way we are funded, 6% of disaster costs, that can really ebb and flow from year to year depending on what kind of disaster activity there is. So BRIC needs to be a program that can ebb and flow with those dollars, being maybe a smaller program one year and a bigger program the next year. And then we wanted to provide consistency. We are one of 3 hazard mitigation assistance programs that FEMA has, along with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that Roosevelt will talk about later, and we also have a flood mitigation assistance program. So we wanted to, where it made sense, be consistent with those programs so that the folks that manage all these programs see similarities. I also want to give a nod to FEMA's strategic plan. This is a document we've also taken into consideration in our program design. We are one of the things, or how FEMA is responsive into goal number 1 of building a culture of preparedness. That includes increasing the investment into resiliency, and BRIC is a factor in that. As far as readying the nation for catastrophic disasters, we hope that the projects that we implement will help reduce or lessen the effects of those disasters. And then the third one, in reducing the complexity of FEMA, that's something you always want to do in program design, but we have been thinking about as we implemented the program, is trying to make sure that we are reducing complexity, that we're a program that people can easily or use. The latest piece that came out, we were very excited to have the proposed BRIC policy just go through the Federal Register notice process. The policy is what is going to be the foundational document for the BRIC program. It was put in the Federal Register on April 10th and closed on May 11th. We are currently going through all the comments. We received 147 submissions. Of those submissions, they included about 900 comments that were individual that we're responding to. So we're adjudicating those comments and going to get it back out, do a summary of how we did the adjudication with the revised policy coming out later this year. To give you some of the key factors of the policy, one thing that talks about is how the program is structured through its funding mechanisms. So there are 3 different funding mechanisms. There's going to be a state and territory allocation. Every state and territory will get a flat amount of funding, and that funding amount will be listed in the NOFO, or the Notice of Funding Opportunity, that's coming out in August. There will also be a tribal set-aside, so there will be a certain dollar amount also listed in the NOFO that will be set aside for our tribal recipients. And then the rest of the money, which has to be at least a majority, will be a project competition. So this will be where the projects come in and they enter a national competition. The NOFO will talk about what are our priorities or how our competition will actually be run. The policy talks about how the funding can be used. So there's 3 basic principles for how the funding is used, and that is, the first one is in the capacity and capability building projects, which I'll describe a little bit further later in the presentation. Of course, the mitigation projects, which are the ones that are done through the project competition, and that's your brick and mortar type projects, construction projects, and then management costs. So funding to support the grants administration for any of the other approved projects. Another use of assistance is technical assistance, and this is a non-financial direct technical assistance. More information as well will be coming out about what that is and how it's administered in the NOFO. But the basic idea is FEMA is going to choose a very small cohort of communities this first year to offer direct technical assistance to help them increase their resiliency in an area that they feel like it needs to be increased in, whether that's helping put a project together or some other planning or financial or whatever it might be method. I always want to give kind of one kind of nugget in the policy as an example of how it's different or how we're changing programs. And one of those is in pre-award costs. So pre-award costs have been allowed in all of our programs, but something we're doing different in BRIC. In PDM, formerly, the start of the pre-award was when the application period opened, and we're removing that barrier. So any cost incurred before submission and approval of the project are potentially eligible no matter when they were incurred. It just has to be an eligible cost, and of course the project has to be approved to be able to get reimbursement for those costs. But that's just one of the ways that the program is going to be different. This is what I lovingly call our pizza tracker. So I was very excited on May 11th when we got to move our red arrow from public comment to BRIC rollout and training. So that is what we're doing now while we're adjudicating the policy and we're putting the final touches and running the NOFO through the concurrence chain. We're doing sessions like today, which is the rollout and training. And there's going to be later in the presentation, I keep saying that, but later in the presentation there'll be even more about future training opportunities. The next step then is with the notice of funding opportunity coming out. That's expected to be late summer, fall of 2020, hopefully in the month of August, with our grant application period opening at the end of September. So this is the piggy bank slide. A lot of people have questions about, well, how is the funding coming? Like, you know, how do you actually get that funding? They see the 6% and they don't know if that's out of the total DRS, disaster relief fund, or something else. So the way this happens is when a disaster is declared, a major disaster declaration, 180 days after that declaration, 6% is taken out of certain sections. So there's 8 different sections of disasters, particularly that FEMA funds. The estimate for those 8 sections at 180 days, 6% is taken and put into a BRIC account. Inside of the disaster relief fund, there's a particular account labeled BRIC, which I call the BRIC piggy bank. And so every time a disaster hits 180 days, 6% of the estimate goes into the BRIC piggy bank. And so that's done kind of on a continuous basis every time a disaster hits 180 days. And then once a year, FEMA will break the piggy bank, take the money out of it, and put it into the BRIC program. So we wanted to have a slide in here that if you're familiar with our PDM or pre-disaster mitigation program, we talked a little bit about how it's different. The first area is that we're going to have different priorities than PDM did. You're going to see the full list of our priorities in the NOFO, but for example, lifelines are important to our program as well as infrastructure, as you can probably guess by the name BRIC. Building codes are particularly important to our program. The Section 1234, while it only has a couple of paragraphs that we've built the program on, it mentions building codes specifically and BRIC's responsibility to building codes. It's a priority for us to have shared responsibility and partnership, that as I discussed earlier in our guiding principles, and then to support innovation. And one thing I always want to say here is innovation doesn't look the same across the country. What's innovative to one community might be old hat to another, but we want to meet people where they are. So we want to help people be innovative to them. We're all in a different space for growth. So that's one thing we want to put in the program is we don't want people to have worry about, well, I don't know that I can be innovative. It's what's innovative for you. As far as how we're looking to build capacity or capability, these are some of the project types that we're looking at funding and our capacity and capability building activities. The first one is project scoping, formerly known by FEMA as advanced assistance. We've renamed it to try to give more clarity about what it is, but it's the idea is that we can provide seed money to help communities formulate projects. When someone knows they have an issue, they know they need to do something about it, but they're just not quite sure what that is, so they're not ready to put a construction application in, project scoping can help them get over that barrier. Another thing is building code projects. So looking at projects that will help a community adopt, better, or enforce their building code. We're looking at funding mitigation planning. So not just the creation and update of mitigation plans, but also how can mitigation planning be integrated into other planning techniques in the community or other plans in the community, as well as how that plan could be implemented. And then a fourth one is partnership. We've had a lot of conversation with communities with, I'd love to have a partner, but I don't know how to get a partner. So we're looking to see how we can help do that through a funding mechanism, help a community identify what their partnership needs are, find partners, cultivate partnership relationships. The next one is that in-person non-financial technical assistance I talked about. So that's where FEMA is looking at having a small cohort of communities that we will offer non-financial direct technical assistance through maybe a variety of different partners to help a community with a certain issue or problem they're having in the resiliency space. The next one is the mitigation action portfolio. So one of the things that came out of our stakeholder engagement was, well, can you tell me what a BRIC project looks like? Or can you explain to me more what a good project is? So this is a document we are formulating now that should be out or plan to be out with the release of the NOFO, that is a collection of around 50 projects that cover geographically the country or cover every known hazard, or at least natural hazard that we cover, and are of different sizes from small to large projects, where it gives you a 2-page snapshot of what that project is, why we think it's good for BRIC, as far as they'll talk about lifelines, they'll talk about co-benefits, the costs, the partners, and it also gives a space where if that project is something that intrigues you, you can click, it gives you links where you can go get some more. But we're hoping with that, this map, the Mitigation Action Portfolio, as we call it, the map, is something that also lives over time. So it's something we can add to as more projects are identified, and gives people an idea of some of the things that can be done on the BRIC program. We're also looking at increasing flexibility. So we're looking at where we can reduce limitations, increase caps, and also allow those pre-award costs, as I discussed earlier. And then finally, we're looking at how we're streamlining processes. We do have a new software system or web-based system that the BRIC projects will go into, and that's called FEMA Go, which stands for FEMA Grant Outcomes. So that will be our application system, and more to come on that. They are finishing the touches and going to start doing trainings on the FEMA Go system. We're also looking at how project extensions are done. One of the comments we got from the stakeholders was how do we give the FEMA regions more control or authority, so project extensions is one where we're looking at that. And then also phase projects. So phase projects are approved or allowed under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. We're looking at doing those as well in BRIC. So if that's in the case that you almost know what you need to do, so you're a little bit further than the project scoping, but you just need to put some final touches on either the design or maybe the environmental, we can go ahead and fund a phase 1 to complete all those deliverables and then move into a phase 2 construction once those deliverables are done. One little note I wanted to say for this PowerPoint too, on some of the slides, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's 3 people with some thought bubbles. Those are where we directly took stakeholder engagement and factored it in. So that's something we always want to, a lot of people in 2019, over 5,000, gave us comments about what they hoped BRIC would be. And we want to make sure that for those folks who took time to comment to us, they are seeing where we have put some of their comments into the program design. So a question we always get is, well, what makes the project eligible? Is this certain project that I like to do in hazard mitigation assistance with FEMA, is that still going to be eligible? Yes, all activities are still eligible. So you'll see on the screen on the left, there's the cover of our hazard mitigation assistance guidance from 2015, which is our latest version. All projects in there will still be eligible for BRIC. They may not be prioritized, and that prioritization will come out with the NOFO, but they are eligible. On top of that, we're adding some additional projects to it. We've talked about the project scoping. We've talked about building codes. In addition, the DRA Section 1205 and 1233 with wildfire and wind, as well as early earthquake warning, bring some additional project types into our fold. At the end of the day, our projects must be, and this is what's in the blue box at the right, they must be cost effective, and we have certain ways to show those cost effectiveness through the benefit cost module or pre-calculated benefits. They must reduce or eliminate risk and damages from future natural hazards. Any kind of construction project must meet the latest 2 consensus codes. It must be built to one of the latest 2 consensus codes. For example, that might be the 2015 or 2018 International Building Code. The community and the state or tribe or territory must have a hazard mitigation plan that's approved by FEMA, and the project must align with the plan. And then the project must meet all environmental and historic preservation requirements. So those are our, at a base, our eligibility for our mitigation project. In addition to that, there are elements that we're looking to have in these projects that will make them good mitigation projects. So the last slide talked about what's your base eligibility. These are what's going to make a good application. One is you talk about that risk reduction. You're showing that you have a natural hazard risk reduction, that you're increasing resiliency in a community, that you may have co-benefits or ancillary benefits in your project, but you give a good description of how that risk, what that risk reduction is. And then second to that is you speak through your grant implementation approach. So that great risk reduction project you just described, how does your grant implementation approach give the reviewer the confidence that you'll be able to do it? Do you describe your work schedule, your resources, your time, everything like that really makes it a good, makes us confident that the project you described can be done. The third one is how you're including innovation in your project planning and implementation. We also are going to be looking at populations impacted. Like, are you talking about in your community or where you're doing this project, who and how many people are going to directly benefit from the project? What have you done with partnerships and outreach? So partnerships to get others involved and outreach to make sure people are informed. Are you looking at future conditions so that we know that the project you build today will also be good tomorrow? So have you looked at sea level rise or land use changes, things like that? And then the last one is we're going to be looking at the infrastructure and community lifelines. Talking a little bit more about building codes. As I said, the DRA, as it says here too, provides legislative mandate to support broader adoption of updating building codes. So you're going to see that not only are we funding building code activities to help a community become more disaster resistant, but also the projects must be built to, as I said before, one of the latest 2 consensus codes. And you're going to see that the building codes are very much a priority for the program. I talked a little bit about community lifelines, and they are going to be factoring into the program as well. Community lifelines as defined by FEMA, and you'll see the circles down there that describe what the different lifelines are. Those are those were created in the beginning for response as a way to structure and to operationalize reporting of response. That these 7 areas were the most kind of paramount for a community that after a disaster we needed to know how they were working and were they coming online. They typically haven't been used in a mitigation community or in the mitigation space, but as we were building BRIC, we thought about that if these are the things that are most critical to a community in being able to recover faster, then that is something that if you mitigate against those lifelines or mitigate for those lifelines, then you will either reduce the damage or eliminate the damage, and hopefully then either there won't be a response at all, there won't be a recovery at all, or at least it should be quickened. It should happen faster. So that is one of the things, for example, we've done with our mitigation action portfolio is all the projects we're examining in the map, we're saying, okay, these are the mitigation lifelines, the lifelines that they represent. wanted to give you all a few examples of just different projects that we have funded in the past or have been funded in the past that we like for BRIC. One of them is the nature-based infrastructure approach that was taken for the Underground Resiliency Park in Hoboken, New Jersey. This is a very urban area that where you see that park underneath has, think about 1 million gallons of flood storage. So it not only offers flood reduction for the neighborhood, but then it also incorporates a green feature or nature-based solution on top where you have a lot of usability for the community in a park. On top of that, this is a project that was funded by PDM. It had a $10 million cap, federal share, but then it had $47 million in other funding that was brought to the table for it. So it was a project that was overmatched and partnered. This is another example of a nature-based solution for flood. This is the St. Vrain in Longmont, Colorado. So to have flood reduction, they not only used full nature-based solutions to put in that flood reduction, but they also offered the ancillary benefit of, you can see the park feature that's put to the right with the trail. This is a project that I was very happy that I got to tour back in August, and this is one that was not FEMA funded, but was partner funded through several different entities that are listed there on the slide. And this is with Blue Lake Rancheria Tribe up in Northern California, where they put in a whole campus microgrid solution. So it is a solar array mixed with battery, mixed with generator, and it offers, you can see a picture there, it's their hotel. So it can offer full support, and that hotel was turned into a hospital back in October of 2019 when the power went out for a few days, and is credited with saving 4 lives. They also have a gas station on site that can stay up when the power goes out. It's the only one in the community, so response vehicles were able to use it during that outage. They have medical supplies that can be refrigerated. So community members, they open it up to more than just their tribe. They service the entire community, and they can bring their insulin in to be able to refrigerate it and keep it in good condition. And one thing also is they can, if the power totally goes out, they can snap off and be an island themselves. But they also have energy efficiency in that when there's peak and flows, they can turn on the microgrid as needed. And the last example is one with Texas County Memorial Hospital in Houston, Missouri, where they as well looked at how they would be able to keep power going in outages. This is a slide, and I think that there's a file where you all can download on the Adobe Connect. So I won't go through everything in this slide, but this gives you a little bit more information about the project scoping that I was talking about, the idea of seed money being available to build a project application or to assess out what the need is so you can apply in the future. And this is a slide as well that I always want to include. It's about our benefit cost analysis. And most importantly, you'll see there's a link at the bottom where you can get more information. All of our projects, as I stated before in the eligibility slide, have to be shown to be cost effective, and that is done with FEMA through our benefit cost analysis tool. You must have a 1.0 for your benefit cost ratio, or you have to use one of FEMA's pre-calculated benefits for certain project types. Technical assistance was something we heard a lot about in our stakeholder feedback. And we've talked a lot about, the different technical assistance that we're looking at offering. That was something that we heard from people they needed is more help. So we're doing things like the mitigation action portfolio, that non-financial technical assistance. We're going to have webinar series that we're starting in July that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes to offer technical assistance. We're going to have, along with our NOFO coming out, our Notice of Funding Opportunities, will be a series of program support materials that will be quick fact sheets to explain different aspects of the BRIC program and give more detail. as well as, of course, there's our regional offices that always offer technical assistance to our applicants. Partnership is something that we talked about earlier in the principles that's very important in the BRIC program, and we are in a long-term effort. It's not something I know we're going to be able to do quickly, but a long-term effort to build a partnership network in BRIC. And we're looking at really 3 different levels of people who partner with us. And this could be other federal agencies, our traditional partners of state, local, tribal, and territory, as well as we're talking to a lot of non-governmental organizations who are interested in being partners in BRIC. And that one, the first one is what we call champions, and those champions are ones who want to take our message and amplify it. So be able to spread the message, so to speak, about BRIC, to make sure that everyone who needs to know about us knows about us. The second is service providers. These are folks who have some technical or other resources and offer that. So, for example, if another federal agency has engineering support and they can either help us or help communities with technical needs. And then the last are connectors, and really that's about people who either have funding or can leverage relationships and bring funding to the table. Our program is 75% federal, 25% non-federal, so where that non-federal is coming from. We do have, for small and impoverished communities, a 90-10 with 90% federal and 10% non-federal. I want to give a nod to our other programs. Roosevelt's going to talk to you in a few minutes about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. So that's one of our 3 programs in HMA. And then, of course, there's Flood Mitigation Assistance, which is the sister program for BRIC, and it's in the sister program for PDM, with both being annual competitions. So coming out, FMA will be announced at the same time as BRIC this year. And then there's you may know about 406, which is in public assistance, so another area of FEMA, but that is a great source of funding that can offer mitigation to damaged facilities after a disaster. Of course, FEMA doesn't own all mitigation funding. For example, HUD, who are on with their webinar today. So that's another federal agency that offers resiliency funding through CBG. We also know that there's funding with NOAA, Army Corps, DOE, DOT, and then, not all resiliency or mitigation funding is from federal. So states also have, some states have their own mitigation funds. So I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about the engagement we did last year in the summer of 2019. We did, across the months of June and July of 19, multiple in-person engagement, virtual forums, emails and letters, and formal comments. Through all of that, we ended up with more than 5,000 non-attributable comments. So we can't say who they came from, but we received over 5,000 comments and 75 agency letters. That was the largest stakeholder engagement ever conducted by FEMA or ever responded to FEMA. We then employed a graduate student who took all those comments and synthesized it into a 78-page report. So you'll see the BRIC website is fema.gov/BRIC, and that is, I'd love you to bookmark that. That's where we plan to put all our materials as they become final. Right now, we have that stakeholder feedback report on there, so you can read the 78 pages, or we also have a 4-page summary, so you can read that. It tells what people thought or what people wanted to see in the BRIC program. It does not talk about how we are responsive to it, but it does show what all we heard. And then hopefully, through the policy, NOFO, and other program support materials that are going to be coming out, you'll see how we incorporated all that. Just for your reference, these are the kind of the top themes that came across in the stakeholder feedback. And this is how the report is built out. So they centered around issues with the application process and requirements, capacity and capability building, hazard mitigation planning and plan and project implementation, project monitoring and evaluation and lesson learning, risk-informed decision-making, and then we have a specific chapter dedicated to tribal issues. So what's coming up next is, if you remember way back in the presentation, I showed a pizza tracker, and I showed that we were in the red bubble of program rollout and training. Outside of webinars we're doing this month, such as this one, we're going to start our own webinars in the month of July. So every Wednesday for 1 hour in the month of July, we'll be doing a series of 5 webinars that lead up to the Notice of Funding Opportunity for BRIC. So they're going to be built around the subjects of an overview of BRIC, which will be this presentation I'm giving today. We're going to be doing one about what's the meaning of the BRIC name. So what do we mean with resilient infrastructure and resilient communities? We're going to be doing one on building codes, one on lifelines, and one on nature-based solutions. And that will then flip over to, after the NOFO is released at the first part of August, then we'll go into NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunities, webinars that are very tactical, because at that point we can talk about all aspects of the design of the program and the priorities. So we'll go into webinars where we're explaining that, as well as how to apply. And here are some different resources. As I stated, over to the right, you've got the, to the left, you've got the FEMA website, or the BRIC website, which is fema.gov/BRIC. And then I've also got some links to other websites from FEMA that are important in the BRIC program. One being, we're a member of the Hazard Mitigation Assistance group. So you have a link to HMA's website there. Then you'll see a link to the Community Lifelines Implementation Toolkit. So if you want to learn more about Community Lifelines, there's once again the link for our benefit cost analysis. There's a link for hazard mitigation planning, and then there's the ISO mitigation building codes link. So if you want to learn more about building codes and the Building Code Effectiveness Grading Schedule, or BSEGs, there's a link there. And with that, that completes my presentation. I want to thank everyone for listening, and once again, thank HUD.
Okay, thank you, Camille. I learned a lot. Appreciate your input. I'm going to talk about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. It was created in November of 1988 and is authorized by Section 404 of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act. I will have slides here that are really designed for a general audience and certainly for HUD grantees who may not necessarily be very familiar with our HMGP program. So the program was enacted in 1988, came online in 1989, and so it makes HMGP the longest running mitigation grant program, and certainly for FEMA. And one thing I'd like to point out as well is that HMGP is currently the 4th largest grant program behind public assistance, individual assistance, and preparedness. So since 1989, there's been roughly 1,669 presidential major disaster declarations, and that has generated approximately $20.7 billion in HMGP funds. So both Michaela and Camille allude to the importance of leveraging various funding streams, federal funding streams, to support your risk vulnerability and trying to make sure that you are promoting long-term resilience. And what that I wanted to kind of have this slide to kind of talk about the value of mitigation to society. So the National Institute of Building Sciences in an interim study noted that for every dollar of federal investment, generally up to $6 is earned in terms of return on investment for benefits. That ratio goes up with the federal investment in riverine flood mitigation. So for every dollar spent, you have about $7 in benefits. And if you incorporate disaster-resistant building codes, those benefits yield $11 in benefits for every dollar spent. Again, just trying to reinforce some of the messages from Camille and Michaela in terms of leveraging your CDBG programs with FEMA programs and any other relevant federal programs that provide funding. With that being said, the value is driving down disaster costs for communities, and certainly with respect to natural hazards, being able to leverage the mitigation in terms of your federal investment certainly can reduce community vulnerability to natural hazards. So here are some examples of common natural hazards. We have earthquakes, wildfires, hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. I'm going to provide some examples of mitigation activity types, particularly related to flood and tornado and hurricane. But I just wanted to kind of point to these as some of the most common natural hazards that certainly impact our grantees. Camille and Michaela also pointed to the importance of mitigation planning, and I wanted to spend a little time talking about that. So for all of our mitigation grant programs, mitigation planning is very key. And certainly when you look at the CDBG-MIT action plan and that mitigation needs assessment, certainly folding in the hazard identification and risk assessment components of the mitigation plan certainly can help with that mitigation needs assessment. Establishing that baseline, if you will, that foundation, where are your risks, how are they impacting, or hazards, how are they impacting your critical infrastructure, your critical services, folding that into your risk assessment helps you to develop and strategize your funding or prioritizing your funding, certainly for mitigation. Camille talked about community lifelines, and so certainly that mitigation plan component can incorporate that information, and in doing so, you really are taking an opportunity to build your long-term resilience, and as the slide says, breaking that cycle of disaster damage, then restoration, and then repeat damage. So this is very key. I mentioned at the outset that HMGP is authorized by Section 404 of the Stafford Act, and HMGP is declared after a presidential major disaster declaration. So a state, a tribe, a territory governor, or chief executive can make a request for a presidential major disaster declaration, and then it's reviewed at several layers within FEMA, and if that request is approved, then the grantee will have funding available for their respective designated area. So they can choose to target specific areas with their HMGP funding if it's approved, or they can generally use it more globally within their jurisdiction. So with that being said, I would encourage the grantees on the call here, especially those who are very, very new to HMGP, to take a look at our regulations, we have regulations at 44 CFR, Part 206, and that's Part N. And then also, too, and this was alluded to by Camille, we have that the flood FY15 HMA guidance, and an addendum that will provide you with some additional information as well. So this is actually a pretty important aspect of the HMGP program, because this is the process that we use to determine funding availability for a particular grantee. So if a grantee has a standard mitigation plan, these tiers here, or the first three bullets, I'm calling them tiers, they apply for grantees with a standard mitigation plan. So again, based on our regulations and our current guidance and policies, up to 15% of the first $2 billion for disaster assistance could be obtained by a grantee. And let me stop here for a second. So Camille talked about those funding streams that kind of make up this pot of money, so to speak. Examples would include public assistance, individual assistance. Those are two huge areas within our agency that address disaster assistance. So if you have a larger disaster, the percentage goes down to 10%, and within that tier is between $2 billion and up to $10 billion again. And then for our really large disasters, the percentage decreases again of 7.5%, again within that threshold between $10 billion and $35.33 billion. Now, one of the things to kind of illustrate this, how this process works, many of you may be familiar with our efforts in Puerto Rico. For HMGP, it is by far our largest disaster historically. Again, they had a standard mitigation plan, and so they had to go through these levels of process here, these bullets I mentioned, and with that, they generated about, the disaster generated almost $3 billion in terms of the federal share. So certainly try to illustrate that. One last thing, for our grantees or applicants who meet the requirements, they may have what we call an enhanced plan. And as an incentive for the additional work that they do to have an enhanced plan, their percentages increase up to 20%. There's no tier, and essentially, again, there's a cap here of not exceeding $35.33 billion. So here's the HMGP timeline. Again, from that presidential major disaster declaration all the way to the closeout, there's a number of steps within the, or milestones within the grants management life cycle. Once the initial declaration is approved, their funding that's generated. There's several points within the first year to kind of check and see if there's any fluctuations in the amount available for that particular grantee. Once that amount is set, generally within that first year, our grantees start working with our local communities, reaching out to them to say, here are some priorities for HMGP for this particular declaration. The local communities will be working to submit applications along those lines. And then the local community will be working with that grantee to try to make sure that they're submitting complete and eligible applications. So if these particular applications are approved by FEMA, then a formal contract or a grant agreement is established, and also a similar contract is developed between the grantee and the local community, and they're free to begin to implement that project. There may be, so one of the factors for HMGP and certainly for other mitigation grant programs is that we basically don't upfront the money all at once. We simply want them to submit receipts and documentation, and we reimburse them for expenditures that are considered to be eligible. So this whole entire grants management life cycle from start to finish should be 36 months. You can imagine when you have major events like Hurricane Harvey in Texas or the Hurricane Maria that impacted Puerto Rico, this life cycle for HMGP could be much longer than 36 months. But generally speaking, that is the period of performance that we have for our program. Here's a list of eligible activities. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but later in my presentation I will touch on a few that are quite common. I would like to point out that HMGP is a all-hazards program, meaning all natural hazards are generally addressed, mitigated, and we have activity types to address those hazards. This is in contrast to the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which is primarily looking at addressing flood mitigation and in turn trying to reduce the impact to the National Flood Insurance Program from rep loss and severe rep loss properties. I want to take a few minutes and really kind of focus a little bit more on advanced assistance, the 5% initiative projects, and management costs. So for advanced assistance, we had the Sandy Recovery and Improvement Act of 2013, and it amended the Stafford Act. And I know that Camille alluded to some aspects of this in her presentation, but for HMGP, this advanced assistance is a provision that will provide, quote-unquote, upfront money. I think Camille said seed money, to help with development of mitigation strategies, to help collect and analyze information, technical information related to BCA, or you may have certain projects that require engineering design. But the idea is to really help our grantees think through all of the decisions that need to be made in order to submit complete and eligible applications for funding. There is a cost cap, so generally speaking, we don't allow more up to 25% of a given disaster in terms of the funding available, and that translates to a maximum amount of $10 million. Another popular HMGP component, or at least this is pretty popular, is the 5% initiative. So Camille talked about the use of the benefit cost analysis and our requirements that for every quote-unquote dollar spent, there needs to be a dollar benefit. It's hard to have that level of analysis in terms of benefit cost if a project is kind of hard to quantify. So, for example, you may have a generator project or GIS software, and in those instances, FEMA is trying to provide some flexibility with our grantees to allow them to submit these projects subject to a cost-effectiveness narrative. And these projects still have to meet our other program requirements. And so one other comment I'll make is that we have an additional 5% on top of the first 5%. And we changed this through the the FY15 HMA guidance. And in doing that, we wanted to kind of have an all hazards approach, kind of open that up a little bit to cover all natural hazards. And in doing so, grantees are in a position to really look at their long-term resilience. And in turn, we expect them to either improve their BRIC score, as Camille noted. There may be floodplain management components that they may want to look at, or certainly they may want to update or incorporate disaster-resistant building codes. So these are some pretty interesting aspects to help support their program delivery. I wanted to talk about the changes from the DRSI to management costs for HMGP. Section 324 of the DRSI addresses management costs, and I don't want to get too much into it, but I will say that for grantees, the changes to this legislation more than doubled the amount that was previously available to our grantees for management costs under HMGP. And then for our sub-grantees, we now have a steady stream or potential steady stream of funding available for management costs connected to the project award. I would encourage you, especially those of you who are new to our HMGP program, to take a look at the interim management cost policy for HMGP. That's FEMA policy number 104-11-1. Again, that's FEMA policy number 104-11-1. Camille certainly spoke to this in her discussion about BRIC. I don't want to repeat what she said, but I do want to focus a little bit more on what are considered to be the minimum project criteria outlined in our HMGP regulations. So again, our projects need to be under HMGP, need to be in conformance with the state mitigation plan. Certainly, Camille and Michaela talked about the importance of that state or standard mitigation plan to help with establishing risk and vulnerabilities. The project needs to have a beneficial impact, and again, we tend to establish this through feasibility analysis as needed, and certainly with the benefit cost analysis in order to help establish that beneficial impact. Also, for HMGP, there are potentially floodplain management and wetlands requirements that need to be adhered to. Certainly, in EHP, historic preservation, and all other applicable laws, regulations, and policy, including that of the National Flood Insurance Program, could apply. So, again, for all of our programs, but particularly for HMGP, individuals and businesses cannot apply directly to FEMA for assistance. They need to submit their applications to quote-unquote sub-applicants. Here's a list of examples. For HMGP in particular, we have private nonprofits, local governments, state agencies that are fairly recognized tribes. These entities will look at the application, they will develop it, make sure that it's programmatically eligible, that it's complete, all the required documentation is there, and then they'll submit those applications into the grantees or applicants. And here are some examples. We have territories. I talked about Puerto Rico, Camille mentioned the Blue Lake Rancheria Tribe in Northern California, and then we have the 50 states. As these applications are reviewed for eligibility and completeness, they're submitted to FEMA for final determination, and if they're approved, then obviously that opens up the funding stream for HMGP to implement that particular program. One thing that I wanted to really emphasize, and I think this came from Michaela and her portion of the webinar, that importance, and also Camille, the importance of this private and public partnership and then coordinating. If you have funding streams available from various federal programs, looking at opportunities to coordinate those. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is by our regulation for HMGP, we have a cost share. So FEMA may not contribute above or up to, they can only contribute up to 75% of the cost measures approved for funding under HMGP. And not all of our grantees are in a position where they can meet this non-federal share match. So there's various mechanisms that may be available in contributions. They may have some cash. There's other approaches. But one important and key approach is certainly leveraging any CDBG funds that are available. Again, there are some nuances between CDBG programs versus some of the FEMA Mitigation Grant Programs, but still there are opportunities to be able to leverage and coordinate these funds. And in doing that, that certainly goes back to the comment that I made about the value of mitigation, and certainly the yield and return on investment when you're able to have federal investments that you can use for mitigation projects. One particular thing that I wanted to point out here, and this goes back to something Michaela said early on, clearly for CDBG-MIT, there are certain national objectives and certain requirements for eligibility. This includes looking at LMI and also mid areas. We have no such requirements for HMGP. And in terms of how HMGP can be prioritized, the grantees under our program certainly through our regulations have the authority to prioritize their available funding as they see appropriate. With that being said, the projects still need to meet all of our programmatic eligibility requirements. We talked about BCA, we talked about EHP, technical feasibility, aligning with that mitigation plan. But I wanted to kind of point that out for your benefit for consideration as you're looking at designing your particular mitigation programs for your respective areas. So here I want to kind of take you through some examples of common mitigation activity types that we typically fund under HMGP. Here you see a picture of the buyout or acquisition and demolition. And essentially this is an at-risk structure. The structure is demolished. Contents are placed, disposed of properly, and then from there the resulting open space is de-restricted as open space, and that's permanently done. The intent is to promote natural and beneficial functions of the floodplain, and I can't think of anything that would permanently do that in a better way than simply removing a at-risk structure in a special flood hazard area and then turning that resulting land back to its natural state. With that being said, I do want to point out that for FEMA, we tend to use the term acquisition and buyout pretty interchangeably. That's not the case for HUD. There's a bit of a distinction between the term acquisition and then what would be understood or considered as a FEMA buyout. I certainly wanted to kind of point that to for your awareness. With that being said, FEMA buyouts roughly comprise about 22% of all HMGP dollars obligated since the late 1980s, and certainly is the number one mitigation activity by far. And in terms of amount obligated, to date, we have about almost $2.7 billion that have been expended for some form of a buyout. Here's another activity. This is a buyout as well. And the idea here is that you may have structures that are at risk, but they haven't been damaged, and they are in really good shape, that they are up to a code that allows them to have a good chance of lasting for quite a while. So a grantee may elect to work with their community to save these structures, basically remove them from the special flood hazard area, relocate them outside of the special flood hazard area, and this is essentially what constitutes a quote-unquote buyout and relocation project. Structure elevations are not quite as popular as acquisitions, although they are an important activity type. With that being said, depending upon the location of the structure in the special flood hazard area, there may be certain design requirements for a foundation, the types of foundations that you can use, and certainly height requirements that are necessary for the respective area of the floodplain that the structure is located. With that being said, I would like to call your attention to the fact that next Thursday, June 11th, HUD will be sponsoring another webinar, and this is with another part of FEMA, FEMA's Risk Management Directorate, and their building science subject matter experts, who will talk with our grantees about ASCE 24, that's American Society for Civil Engineers, their publications, to ASCE 24, and I think this will be very interesting and certainly will be very detailed, but will give you a lot of important and valuable information for the design requirements connected to structure elevations, and encourage you to participate. Another form of an elevation is this depicted here by this red circle. You may not necessarily have to have the whole entire structure elevated, but certainly there's occasions where we will just provide mitigation funding to make sure that that utility system is properly elevated. There are some instances for structure elevations where the structure is not in good shape. It could be in disrepair, or certainly built to a code from long ago. And in those instances, it would be almost impossible from a design standpoint to safely elevate that structure. In these cases, the grantees may elect mitigation reconstruction. The essence is that part of that structure, or maybe even the entire structure, will be demolished, and in its place, an improved and elevated structure is constructed. I would like to point out that for these types of activities, they need to be located outside of a V zone and also outside of a regulated floodway. For all structure elevation projects that are quote-unquote mitigated with FEMA funds, we do have some requirements for flood insurance being maintained for the life of the property, and certainly for more information about mitigation reconstructions, buyouts, and other structure elevation projects, we have the FY15 HMA guidance and also the addendum, and there are some chapters there that address these activity types for you to get more information about the design requirements. Here's an example of localized flood risk reduction. This is a popular activity. Approximately $1.6 billion has been spent on some of these activities. The idea is that with these localized flood risk reduction projects, they're smaller in scope than maybe a regional watershed project, but what you can do is simply design your project to meet the needs for your respective community or neighborhood, and target mitigation funds to make sure that you are conveying water and certainly reducing flood potential. Here's an example of a culvert. You may have a retention pond, a weir, or a detention pond. And again, there's some information in our FY15 HMA guidance that addresses aspects for localized flood risk reduction projects. So I know I spent a lot of time talking about flood-related activities, but we also do have activities related to wind, and the next two slides certainly will speak to those. Here is an example of shutters, both for public buildings and for residential structures. The intent here is to provide a measure of protection and mitigate against flying debris, that could damage those doors and windows. And so these are examples of wind retrofits, and there's a FEMA publication 804 that will provide you with a lot more information about details, and certainly examples of potential wind retrofit techniques. Here is the community safe room built to a FEMA 361 standard. The idea is that these community safe rooms provide immediate life safety protection in the event of a major hurricane or tornado. Certainly we have information on this activity type in our FY15 HMA guidance and the addendum. There's a chapter that's specifically designed to address this activity type. There are location requirements. This particular structure needs to be close to the impacted population, and there's also some size requirements. We try to make sure that we provide just enough space for the proposed occupants that will be using this facility. So again, look at FEMA 361, that publication, and also the addendum to the FY15 HMA guidance for more details on this particular activity type. So some of our grantees may elect to have an individual safe room, and this would be a little bit different from what's certainly available through a community safe room. The intent is still the same. We're looking to provide immediate life safety protection for the occupants of the structure. Obviously, the safe room here, as shown in this picture, was effective and certainly didn't experience the same amount of damage as you can see surrounding it. So we have certainly covered a lot of ground here today in our presentation, and I want to thank Camille, Michaela, for all of their contributions. And with that, I'm going to kind of do a quick summary. So a couple of things I want to point out. Again, to emphasize some points that were made today. There's a lot of value in terms of that federal dollar being able to support, in terms of federal funds, your mitigation programs. We talked about the importance of that return on investment, especially certain activities such as disaster-resistant building codes and riverine flood mitigation, for example. So if you as a grantee, you have funding from HUD and from FEMA, certainly you can leverage that mitigation plan to help you with your data-informed investments. Michaela spoke to that, and certainly Michaela and Camille spoke to being able to leverage these funding streams to help you with your long-term resilience. With that being said, Michaela spoke to the 4 HUD goals for CDBG-MIT, and so looking at the value of FEMA mitigation, aligning that with CDBG-MIT purpose and goals. For goal number 1, in particular, we have this looking at data-informed investments, and certainly the conversation that Camille had and led for BRIC, and in particular looking at project scoping, that is important. We call it advanced assistance under HMGP, but certainly there's technical feasibility requirements, and all of our programs require benefit cost analysis. So again, this helps support the data-informed investments, looking at addressing rep-lost properties and protecting critical infrastructure. For goal number 2, looking at comprehensively analyzing disaster risk and updating hazard mitigation plans. There's that hazard identification and risk assessment component found with each mitigation plan. Again, that allows the community to establish their baseline in terms of risk, identifying areas that are vulnerable. Certainly through the BRIC conversation, there was discussion about community lifelines, how they intersect and certainly impact your other lifelines. And so all of our programs, whether it be for HUD or FEMA, certainly are intended to try to provide long-term resilience for critical infrastructure and certainly for the constituents. Michaela talked about the value of land mitigation planning, as you can see represented by the circles here on the right, leveraging some of that to connect to land use planning, to have building code connections, and then infrastructure planning. She also talked about evolving disaster risk, and so all of that are factors that can be considered into the assessments for mitigation plans. HUD goal number 3 is looking at adopting policies that support local and regional priorities, driving down disaster costs, certainly having an impact on reducing risk to community lifelines, and also